This lecture examines the most important resource for both the Northern and the Southern armies, the common soldier. Approximately 3 million men served in the Union and Confederate forces. The composition of the Army mirrored the respective societies from which these soldiers came in terms of occupation, class, and other demographic categories. Today, we will examine the typical soldier by addressing some of the factors that motivated men to enlist and then remain in the Army, the routines of camp life, and assess the ravages of disease and battlefield wounds on the ranks of the men in both armies. We will conclude with a brief examination of just how resolute both men were in the face of numerous obstacles and hardships. Approximately 2 million men served in the North, which accounted for approximately 50% of the military age pool. In the Confederacy, a total of 750,000 to 850,000 men served, representing about 75% to 85% of the white military age pool. Now, in the Civil War, the principal building block of these armies was the company. Often raised from a single town or county, often entire regiments were commissioned this way as well. Therefore, they served in units with strong regional identification and frequently shared tents with relatives or friends. A company had 100 men. A regiment consisted of 10 companies. Therefore, on paper, a regiment would have 1,000 men. 2 or more regiments in a brigade, 2 or more brigades made up a division, 2 or more divisions in a corps, with 2 or more corps comprising an army. By the midpoint of the war, a veteran regiment possessed 1,000 men on paper. In actuality, it usually had 400 men and sometimes less. Losses to disease, battlefield wounds, desertion, and stragglers all contributed to the lower numbers. In mid-September of 1862, as Lee's army approached the battlefield of Antietam, the average strength of his regiments was under 180 men, while on paper it should have been 1,000. This figure represents just one example of the tremendous toll the war placed on the soldiers. With the outbreak of the war, what motivated these men to enlist? Early in the war, people enlisted with people they knew. They served alongside family members, neighbors, and friends. People who, in theory, could write home about their behavior and their performance, both individually and the performance of the company. Consequently, there was not a feeling of isolation, but a strong belief that any behavior, good or bad, would be conveyed back home to friends and family. The men in the Army were extremely diverse. In the Confederate Army, over 100 different occupations have identified. A typical regiment, the 19th Virginia, had 749 original members. Occupations listed on enlistment papers included 302 farmers, 80 laborers, 56 machinists, 24 students, 14 teachers, 10 lawyers, 3 blacksmiths, 2 artists, a well digger, a dentist, 4 who classified their profession as gentlemen, and then probably the most popular, 1 distiller. The Northern regiments were more diverse. As in the South, over half who served were farmers or agricultural laborers. However, over 300 different occupations have been compiled from federal muster rolls. These figures represent the more sophisticated economy the North had developed over the South. Now, the average soldier was a native-born white Protestant farmer who was single and between the ages of 18 and 29. While 18 served as the minimum age of enlistment for much of the war, evidence exists for children of 9, 10, and 11 years of age enlisting. They served as drummer boys, musicians, ambulance drivers, but they also fought and died. Many men in their 60s, 70s, and even 80s enlisted. While many of these men did not serve in the armies that actively campaigned across the countryside, nevertheless, there's a stunning wide range of ages represented in the Northern and Southern armies of the Civil War. Now, while many were native-born Protestants, immigrants played a key role. Here's the flag of one of the most important immigrant brigades, the Irish Brigade, especially Germans and Irish Catholics. Immigrant rates in antebellum America were unusually high. In 1860, about 30% of the military-age white males in the North were first or second generation immigrants. In the Union Army, approximately 1 in 4 serving was a first or second generation immigrant, mostly Germans and Irish, while many other nationalities were also represented like Norwegians, Swedes, and others. The Confederate Army had a much lower immigrant force, about 9%. However, this was higher than the proportion of foreign-born men in the Confederacy, which was about 5 to 6%. In total, slightly less than 10% in the Confederate Army and slightly more than 25% in the Union were either foreign-born or a second-generation immigrant. Native Americans also fought on each side. The Confederate Army had 3 brigades of Cherokees, Chickasaws, Choctaw, and Seminoles. The Union Army had 1 brigade, mostly of Creeks. But regardless of the side, Native Americans who fought were treated extremely poor compared with the white troops. The Northern Army had 180,000 colored troops. This represented 9% of all who wore the blue uniform during the war. Recently, a good deal of scholarship and discussion has emerged about black men serving in the Confederate Army. Some scholarship places estimates as high as 50,000 black men served in the Confederate Army. In a fighting capacity, this is simply not true. In fact, there were many black men accompanying the Confederate Army, slaves. They did not serve as soldiers, but in a vast array of non-combatant roles. I suspect many of them would rather be anywhere than with the Army, but the notion that tens of thousands of black men enlisted and carried muskets for the Confederate Army simply is not so. Nevertheless, the notion has proved quite persistent, but it is inaccurate. It did not happen. Although there were black faces serving in both armies, in the Northern armies they served first part in non-combatant roles, then later as soldiers, while the Confederate armies, slaves performed non-combatant roles for the Confederate Army, building earthworks and defense systems. There's also a great debate among Civil War historians as to just why did men enlist in the Civil War, and why did they stay there as conditions became more and more difficult. It is common to find in parts of literature an argument that goes like this: most Civil War soldiers were not well attuned to the ideological currents of their time, or they especially weren't attuned to the political debates that went on before the war or during the war. They didn't care about those things. What they cared about was their unit. Small unit cohesion was what was most important to them. This is what motivated them and what gave primary allegiance to. The famed author William Faulkner, in one of his novels, has a Confederate soldier who sums it up when he was asked why he served in the Civil War, and he responded, "Darned if I ever did know why I fought." There was a study of U.S. soldiers who served in World War II that was released shortly after the war that argued men in the United States forces were not especially concerned with great political issues of their time, rather loyalty to their peers. Well, some Civil War historians have taken that study and applied it to soldiers of the Civil War. The most famous was Bill Wiley, one of the pioneering historians of the common soldier, and he certainly takes this view into much of his work. He doesn't find men who were overly concerned with the ideological issues. He says that they joined for many different reasons: glory, adventure, a desire for camaraderie, basically any number of reasons other than an ideological reason. A war against slavery, a war to defend freedoms, a war to expand the legacy of the founding generations. Wiley would have said that those things were not very important. Now, he would have said peer pressure was important. If all your friends went into going to the service, then you might too, if you did not want to be seen as one who is not patriotic. But on the flip side, there is another current in literature that argues the exact opposite. One leading historian of this field is James McPherson. His book, For Cause and Comrades, is an excellent example. The strain in this literature says that, yes, there was a strong ideological component as to why someone chose to fight on one side or the other. Historians make the argument that many of the soldiers read a lot. Most of them were around 24 years of age. That's the average age. They came from a literate society. They read books. They read newspapers. They went to political speeches. They were attuned to the political climate of their time. They did care about the ideology. They would say they fought for liberty, that they fought for the Republican ideas of the Revolution, that they would say on both sides that they were inheritors of the revolutionary tradition. This strain of literature argues the exact opposite of that World War II study. If it's true that they didn't much care about ideology in World War II, then that was not the case in 1861. Civil War soldiers did care about such things and cared very passionately, especially those who entered freely in the beginning. Before the Confederate draft in the spring of 1862 and the United States draft in the spring of 1863, those men in particular especially cared about the great ideological issues of the time. There's also been an argument about whether idealism, if it was present in the beginning, did it survive to the end? Some scholars say no. The process of fighting, marching, the monotony of camp life, seeing your friends blown apart had eroded that sense of idealism, leaving the only motivating factor, loyalty to their comrades and units. Others argue that idealism remained all the way up till the end, especially among those men who enlisted freely, those who enlisted in the first year of the war. Perhaps the greatest example of this is Edmund Ruffin. Born in 1794, he was 67 years old at the outbreak of the Civil War, enlisted, and he was one of the first to fire at Fort Sumter in April of 1861. In June 1865, he records in his diary, "And now, with my latest writing and utterance, and with what will be near to my last breath, I here repeat and would willingly proclaim my unmitigated hatred to Yankee rule, to all political, social, and business connections with Yankees, and to the perfidious, malignant, and vile Yankee race." After recording these, Edmund Ruffin committed suicide. Well, what about the issue of slavery and emancipation? How did these issues factor in as motivations? Did soldiers go to war to protect slavery? We know that a vast majority of Southern soldiers didn't own slaves, just as the vast majority of Southern whites didn't own slaves. Was slavery the primary motivational factor for them? They certainly didn't write home about it, but they probably wouldn't since it was part of their society. Slavery was a given in Southern society. I think that without a doubt, the overwhelming majority of Confederate soldiers would have viewed their slave-based society as the right kind of society. While they would have approved of slavery in that society, that doesn't mean that they went to war just to protect slavery. They had ideas about personal liberty and freedom that were not centered solely on slavery. They didn't want someone else telling them how to order their society, how to run their lives, and I think this is what they were fighting for. On the Union side, how many soldiers were fighting for emancipation? White soldiers, I think a very small percentage were fighting for emancipation. The key reason that they were taking up arms, the overwhelming number of soldiers would say they were fighting to preserve the Union. They were fighting to put the Union back together. That they were fighting to put the Union, some of them from the very beginning would say that they were fighting for emancipation, but probably not more than about 10%. As the war progressed, the Union soldier embraced emancipation as a goal that would help bring union, if nothing else. But even after the war, I believe a vast majority of Union veterans would say a key goal of their service was to preserve the Union. If emancipation came, that would be fine, but I don't think that they would have listed as one of their primary reasons for being in the Army or staying in the Army. Interesting work on gender studies examines why men served. These studies emphasize masculinity and how important leading concepts of masculinity were in leading men to go into the Army. They really couldn't be seen as men without doing their military duty. Concepts of masculinity were very much tied to fighting, being part of a man's responsibility in his society and his family. Some scholars have argued that masculine identity is more important than ideology in propelling these men into the Army. In reality, all these factors played a role. In fact, individuals were motivated by any combination of these factors. You could be passionate about the Union, but also give in to peer pressure. All kinds of various factors convince men to join the Army and then keep them in the ranks. I don't think there's really any way to tell where these factors rank on a list. Certainly, you would have to place ideology. 50% of the men in particular, the first great wave, would have ideology as an important concept in whatever facet you call it. Love of union, the Southern way of life, liberty, freedom, whatever name you choose. It played an important part. Others, peer pressure, community pressure. If all your friends had gone and only 2 or 3 had not enlisted, there would be tremendous pressure to go. Women wrapping up articles of feminine clothing and sending to men who had not enlisted with notes saying to enlist or start wearing this as your wardrobe. If you were a real man, enlist. Otherwise, you might like to wear petticoats as a new fashion choice. Some men were simply bored. Farming, clerks, a chance for adventure, to be seen as a hero, impress the girls. Images from the Napoleonic Wars or the war with Mexico caused some to seek adventure and glory. Hatred also played a role. Hatred of Yankees or traitors, slavery, either to defend it or emancipate. Many went into the Army just to get clothing, a regular paycheck, seen as a way to make your economic way in the world. Now, this is not a factor in the Confederacy, but all these factors went into a mix that explained why soldiers went into the Army and then why they stayed. Men's motivations were an amalgamation of these various reasons. We'll now turn to camp life and how a majority of men spent their time. The majority of their time was not spent in battle. You were in occasional battle, and then you spent long periods of time where you were not in battle or campaigning, especially during the winter months when you were in protracted camp life. So how did men deal with what was going on in the camp? They faced different challenges in camp than they did in battle. They had to contend with boredom. They had to contend with unpleasant duties and experiences. One of those experiences was drill. They hated to drill. They drilled incessantly. They had to so they could respond in battle to the orders of their commander. They were drilled by company, regiments, brigades, and they just grew tired of it. They grew tired of discipline. These were men that were not used to discipline. They came from a democratic society and were not used to other people telling them what to do. Many responded by arching their back and resisting. They also complained about homesickness. Drill, discipline, homesickness were all experiences soldiers dealt with in camp, and they did not like. They came up with innumerable ways to pass the time. They read and wrote letters. They read the Bible. During this time, it was a much more religious time and figured prominently in many soldiers, but not all of them. Some of the more devout vehemently complained about the others. These are some of the most swearing, card playing, and drunkenness that I ever did see in one place, recorded one Confederate private. Some generals tried to prohibit profanity in their camps, but they were not very effective, especially considering that some of these colonels and generals were notorious for their language. Chess, checkers, sentimental songs were by far the most popular. Home Sweet Home was by far the most popular song on both sides. In summer, they chased animals, races between mice. In the winter, they had enormous snowball battles, some involving thousands of men. Now, these were serious events with even serious injuries such as broken limbs and even in a few instances, death. Perhaps that would be some violent snowball there. Perhaps what men complained about the most was the food. Complained about beef that seemed ancient. In the Northern Army, they complained about hardtack, which they accused of being prepared for the Mexican War instead of the Civil War. In the South, the cornmeal was so coarsely ground that they accused it of causing their gums to bleed. Confederate soldiers, much worse than the Northern Army. You never ever see any heavy soldiers in the Southern Army in their pictures. Lee's army in the winter of 1863 to 1864, their rations consisted of a quarter pound of meat and a pint of cornmeal a day. That's not very much to live on. Also, complaints about medical care, which was a result of conjunction of two trends. On the one hand, the war is fought at a time with greater killing efficiency, with rifled weapons and the Minute ball. At the same time, medicine had not made many important discoveries yet. Therefore, Civil War soldiers were the losers because of this. 2/3 of all men died. They died from disease. Some of the greatest killers were childhood diseases like mumps, measles. This was especially common among rural recruits at the beginning of the war. Dysentery, chronic diarrhea were chronic killers. Again and again appear in letters home that all were suffering from this. Private W.A. Fletcher recorded what was one of the greatest cures for camp diarrhea. I, with a number of others, he records, were sufferers of camp diarrhea, as it was called, and up to that time we'd found no cure. So entering the battle, I had quite a great fear that something disgraceful might happen, and it was somewhat uppermost in my mind. But to my surprise, the excitement or something else had effected a cure. I inquired of some of the others, and they reported a cure too. Going into battle cured your diarrhea. Their diet, living conditions contributed to these factors. They didn't dig latrines in the right locations. Many wouldn't adhere to what we consider basic hygiene. Men wounded in battle suffered miserably, sometimes laying wounded on the battlefield for hours and sometimes up to a day before medical care was administered to them. Even then, the best they could do was to deal with the wounds to the extremities, an arm or a leg. If it was to the core of the body, the conventional wisdom was that it was untreatable and the person will either live or die. Put them to the side. Many who lived in spite of the medical care they received. Bottom line, you didn't want to be sick or wounded. Now, this was no reflection on the surgeons or medical workers of the time. They represented the best of their craft. It's just that their craft had not advanced to the point that it could deal with what was happening to much of the soldiers at the time. Now, if we assess the overall performance of the Civil War soldier, they served honorably and they served well. Desertion rates ran around 12 to 14% on both sides. Overall, the soldiers forged a record that did credit and underscored that many of them, both Union and Confederate, saw the conflict as one waged over many issues and principles, important enough to put up with everything they did. Overall, this group was quite a stalwart group of men. Now, I'm going to leave you with one image, perhaps one of the most famous accounts of the Civil War is the Battle of Gettysburg, with the valiant charge of Pickett's charge, where Pickett's division was basically slaughtered. But some survived, and they gathered together for the 50-year reunion of the Battle of Gettysburg, both Confederate and Union soldiers. They got together, they broke camp, and they did a reenactment. And these stalwart soldiers of Pickett's division made the charge one last time 50 years later.
Thank you, David.